Hi everyone, it's Jess. Welcome or welcome back. Today we are creating a frog scene in Procreate. In the description box you will find the link to download the sketch and color palette for this project, but you can feel free to sketch your own scene or change up the colors. We will be using 3 default Procreate brushes: Studio Pen, Wet Acrylic, and Nikko Rull. We are starting off with the Studio Pen for all of the outlines, and if you're not sure where to find these brushes, info on where they're located is in the description as well. I already have my sketch and color palette imported. I am going to reduce the opacity of my sketch by tapping the N and dragging the slider down to about 30%. Then I am changing the blend mode to multiply in the settings below that. Create a new layer and drag it underneath your sketch layer. Choose dark blue from the color palette and, using the Studio Pen, tracing around the biggest rock that the main frog is sitting on. Dragging the color to fill it, creating a new layer, choosing pink from the color palette, and creating a couple of more rocks overlapping from on either side. Create a new layer, choose orange, and add a couple of more rocks to either side, overlapping with the previous rocks that you've drawn. Create a final rock layer, and choosing the light blue from the color palette, but changing it so that it is a little darker and grayer, add the final rocks into the scene. Okay, we will come back to these later to shade them, but for now, swipe right on each of the rock layers, tap Group, tap the arrow to close the group, and tap the group again to rename it. Then create a new layer and drag it behind the rock group, choosing dark blue from the color palette. And this is our first plant layer. So we will have 3 layers total, and I'm starting with the leafy plants closest to the frogs. And I'm going to fill these in with recolor, so dragging the color into the first leaf and then tapping on the top, fill with recolor, then dragging the cross into one of the leaf shapes, and then you can just tap inside the center of each one with the pencil and fill them in. Creating a new layer, choosing orange, and going in for the next set of leaves. And create a final layer for the leaves, choosing dark blue again, and creating these tallest leaves in the back. And just like before, we will create a group for our plant layers. So swiping right on each of these leaf layers, tapping group, and renaming the group. And now we can start with the frogs. So create a new layer above the rocks, choosing orange, and tracing around the body of the frog. And I'm doing everything except for the toes right now. Okay, and for the toes, the Studio Pen really does the work for you. I am just starting kind of a little further back on the leg and using a very light pressure to start and then pressing down at the end of each toe. Create a new layer above the frog. This is for the eye, so I'm selecting the dark blue from the color palette and tracing around the shapes of each eye. And create one more layer for the eye's highlight. I'm choosing the light blue from the color palette and tracing around the little highlights inside of each eye. And to grab white from the color wheel, I'm just double tapping somewhere near it on the wheel. It will automatically choose the white for you, and then I am just drawing a little line and a dot inside the center of each of those highlights. Swipe right on all of the frog layers to group them together and rename the group. And then create the other arm of the frog by making one more layer, but putting it behind the rock group, and then just making a little line there to show that the frog is holding onto the rock on the other side. You can now turn off your sketch because we are done with all of the flat color and ready to shade. Oh, and if you're wondering about the small frog, do not worry. He will get added in later after all the shading is done. Create 2 new layers above the rock layer that the main frog is sitting on, and double tap on each of those layers. A menu will pop up and turn them into clipping masks. Then on the layer that's closest to the rock, tap the N and scroll down to the multiply blend mode. And on the other clipping mask, tap the N and scroll down to overlay. The multiply layers will be for our shadows and the overlay will be for our highlights. Change the color to the dark blue from the color palette and change the brush to Nikko Rull. I'm using this at a lower opacity, maybe about 75%, and I'm just going over with gentle pressure and the side of my pencil a few times, mostly focusing on the bottom of the rock. Changing to the light blue in the color palette and going to the overlay clipping mask, keeping the same brush, and now going over a few times, starting from the top and overlapping a little bit with where the multiply layer was. I'm changing to a lighter blue and going over a few more times. And as I work, I will be varying the size, pressure, and opacity of the brush. Just keep playing with that, and that will help give you more texture within the piece. I am going to pinch these layers down to combine them. So I'm starting with the multiply clipping mask and pinching it together with the main rock, and then doing the overlay clipping mask and pinching it together. You want to make sure you do them one at a time and in order to preserve the blend modes. Okay, going to the next rock layer, create 2 clipping masks above it, change the first one to multiply, the second one to overlay, and starting on the multiply layer, using the orange, the same color that the rocks started off in, using the pink, the same color that the rocks started off in, adding shadows to the pink rocks. Now, my color palette here is just the base colors of the illustration. So for a lot of the highlights, I'm not choosing one of these colors directly from the palette, but I'm moving the slider on the color wheel to just a lighter version of that base color. And that is exactly what I am doing for the overlay on the pink rocks. Once you've finished the shading and highlights for the pink rocks, you can combine those clipping masks down one at a time in order, starting with the multiply and then the overlay. And create 2 new layers above the orange rock layer, turn them both into clipping masks, and set the first clipping mask as multiply and the second as overlay. Starting with the same orange as the base color on these orange rocks and adding some shadows on the bottom half, going to a lighter shade of that orange on the color wheel, and on the overlay clipping mask adding some highlights. If you want even brighter highlights, you can select white or close to white from the color wheel and use that for the final touches on each rock. And finally, the last rock layer, create 2 clipping masks above it. First is multiply, second is overlay, and go ahead and complete the same shading process that we did for all of the other rocks. Combine those last 2 clipping masks down one at a time, close the rock group, and moving on to the plants. So I'm starting off with my first plant layer. It is the shortest set of plants here. And I'm creating 2 clipping masks above it, setting the first as multiply, the second as overlay. But this time I am going in with the wet acrylic brush. On the multiply layer, I am adding some shadows to the center of these plants, and then choosing a lighter blue from the color palette, and on the overlay clipping mask, add a few highlights. And repeat this process for the other 2 leaf layers, adding clipping masks with shadows and highlights to each one. Okay, and going to our frog group, it is basically the same process to shade this, but it's a little bit different, a few extra details for this guy. So I'm creating 2 clipping masks to start, setting one as multiply and one as overlay. On the multiply layer, and keeping my wet acrylic brush with the orange from the color palette, begin adding some shadows to the frog. So I'm building these up slowly, and I'm starting off with the areas that are going to be the darkest and have the most shadow. So the backs of the legs, a little bit on the chest and underneath the frog's face, and then along the whole top of the back and this area behind the frog's eye, the frog's left eye, the one that's further away from us. Once you've completed a first layer of shadows, increase the size of your brush and start going over and creating even more shadow on the frog. So this time I'm focusing on the whole lower half of the frog's body. To add even more depth, adjust the color to a darker and more red-toned shade and add some more shadows to the backs of the legs and along the top of the frog. And then with that same shade, increase the size of the brush and add some final shadows and bigger strokes across the whole center of the frog. Okay, I'm happy with those shadows for now, so I'm ready to go to the overlay clipping mask. And I'm starting off with the base shade, but moving it on the color wheel to a lighter pale orange. And using gentle pressure on the side of my brush, I'm just going over a few times, and that will start building on the highlight. Okay, I am not going to combine those clipping masks down just yet, but I'm creating a new layer, making it a clipping mask above my frog, and selecting white. I'm using the Studio pen and creating a curve along the frog's back for a highlight, adding a little dot next to it, and then one more curve along the frog's face. Create one more layer above your frog, make it a clipping mask, and choosing pink from the color palette. This time on the blend mode, select Color Burn, and using the Studio pen again, add some small dots along the back and face of your frog. Now I'm going to create a clipping mask above my eye layer, the darker part of the eye, and selecting that blue and the wet acrylic brush, just add some shadow to the lower half of the eye. Okay, now at this point, I recommend zooming out if you are zoomed in and just looking at your whole frog and seeing if you think you need to add any more shading or highlights. Right away, I felt like I needed some more contrast in the shadows, so I'm going back to my multiply clipping layer above my frog, and I'm selecting the orange shade but sliding it to a much more red toned color. And now I'm just going along the back of the frog, that eye section, and the backs of the legs a few more times. I'm going to do the same thing for my highlights, so I'm going to that overlay clipping mask, and this time I'm choosing the yellow, but a much lighter shade of that yellow, and just going over very gently a few times right in the center. Okay, and once you're happy with all your shadows and highlights, you can combine the clipping masks down one at a time in order. I decided to keep the eyes on their own layer just in case. So to make the small frog, it is super easy. Just swipe left on the big frog group, double tap on the group to rename it if you like, and then tap on the arrow in the top left of the screen. Using the uniform setting and magnetics and snapping off, I'm going to decrease the size of the frog. Then on the bottom menu, flip horizontally and drag it to place on the leaves. And the very last step is to give our frogs some water. So I'm creating a new layer above everything else, going back to my studio pen and the lightest blue from the color palette, and just drawing a wavy line in front of the whole scene, dragging the color to fill it in, and then tapping on the N to change the blend mode to multiply. And that is it. I really hope you enjoyed this. If you did follow along, I would really love to see what you created. Please share it with me on Instagram at ZeraCatStudio. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!